Let's get started. Welcome all of you. And now let me just introduce Amrit. Amrit, if you could just introduce yourself, and that would be great. I think we would love
Sure.
to hear from you on about your background.
Okay. Okay. So, I mean, I've lived in 7, 8 countries in 4 different continents. I probably had as many more careers, which we'll talk about more as we go along with this chat today. But recently, the last few years, I've actually been doing MBA admissions, and I've helped over sort of 100 people get into Ivy League or just below Ivy League schools. Um, yeah, Ivy League schools in the US, UK, Canada, etc.
Right. Awesome. Thanks, Amrit, and welcome for on this online chat.
Thank
Uh,
you so much.
we would like to know a lot about you. So let me just go step by step and start with tell us about your journey. So tell us about your pre-MBA journey a little
Okay.
bit so that, we also get to understand what exactly was your life pre-MBA, and then we'll get on to the post-MBA part. So if you could
Sure.
just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So pre-MBA, let me give you a bit about my childhood because I said I've lived in so many different countries, right? So I was born in Singapore, moved to the UK at the age of 5 for education. Halfway through that, my dad sort of his business folded and he had to get a job. So he got a job in Nigeria, and so I would travel back and forth between there. And then, but I still did my schooling in the UK. And then I went to university in America, to Cornell, and well, NYU for the first year, and then Cornell. And then while that happened, he moved to Indonesia, and him and my mom lived there. So I've had this very sort of global, diverse background, right?
Interesting.
Now, as I mentioned, my dad's business had failed, and so like a lot of us, my primary motivation in life at that time was, okay, I need to make money, right? So I went down the path of going through finance, right? I said, okay, what's the quickest way to make money? I want to be a trader, right? Because traders get the big bonuses. And so I was going along that path, and had several different roles to finally get to be a trader. But what happened was that my parents, they both kind of like passed away,
Okay.
right? And within a year and a half. So with that happening, that actually made me step back and really reflect on what I wanted in life, right? And so money wasn't number one. It was more like number two now, right? Or number three. It was just like, okay, what's more important is something I enjoy and so on. And the thing is, I've been so focused on finance and and technology and so on that I hadn't really tried or thought of anything else, right? So for me, the MBA was the greatest, sort of the quickest boot camp to go say, hey, okay, I've got like a good year or two to go and experiment,
Right.
right, and see what I wanted to do and so on. So now the thing is, like I said, I also tried very many different jobs, right? So just to give you some background, I had some entrepreneurial experiences, during college, right? I also worked as a programmer, right, in banking systems. Then as a financial engineer and a structured derivatives trader, right? And so I had all these different careers that I'd done, and plus I also managed a massive project for my bank, right? So suddenly I had all these different career paths, and how do I put together a story for MBA applications, right? So the thing is, I looked at it, and in the end, it's one big important part for MBA applications is to have clear goals. So I'm like, okay, how can I combine my entrepreneurship, my finance, my technology? It's a lot of things happening, right? And so in the end, the story I came up with is that, hey, okay, I want to be an entrepreneur in sort of financial technology,
Right.
right? So that's kind of the story that I had that I used for business school, right?
Interesting. Interesting. So how much of experience did you have before you actually, thought of applying to a B school?
Well, so because I'm Singaporean, right? We have to do national service,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's 2.5 years of military service. That's compulsory,
Right.
right? So including the national service, I had about seven to eight.
Okay. Okay.
So I was a bit older, right,
Mhm.
than the average person. But for me, it was much more important that look, this was to go try and find out what I wanted to do. So it didn't matter to me what age I was going at.
Right. Right. Interesting. Because a lot of people today, when they are applying, they look at, the average experience on on the school website, which
Yeah.
says 4 to 5 years. And, they always feel that 8 years is too much on the right side of, the curve. So they always feel slightly jittery on the experience part of it. So what are your thoughts more around that
So
aspect?
my thoughts, look, at 7, 8 years, you're still fine, right? I think, so if we look at it, average ages of programs tend to be 26, 27, right?
Mm.
Maybe some stretch to 28, right?
Right.
So for me, if you're still at 31, 32 when you're entering,
Mm-hmm.
right, you're still fine because you're not that far away from the mean,
Right.
right? It's the thing is when you become 34, 35, right, then they're going to be like, and the thing is, their thinking is like, okay, if you go in at 34, 35, right, you finish by the age of 37, right? Will you want to be that associate at the consulting firm or the investment bank and
Right.
start your career from scratch, right? So that's what they have difficulty believing,
Right. Right.
right? So that's why I feel at that sort of early 30s, you're still fine.
Right, right. So tell us a little bit more about the cohort, the class that you were part of, right? So, what was the mix of the class, when you were doing your MBA?
Okay, so it was about 35 to 40% international,
Okay.
right? So my class size was roughly about 600, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at about 40%, you're looking at about 250 of which is international, right? I would say a good 30 to 40% of those are actually Indians.
Mm.
Then the next biggest demographic being Chinese, and then after that, all the other demographics.
Right, right. So in terms of your choice of school, right? So what was your thought process behind choosing Booth? Because I guess you got admits from other top schools too.
Yeah.
So what was your rationale behind choosing Booth specifically when we are looking at choosing your
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it was a very difficult. So in the end, I got admits from Wharton, Booth, NYU, and LBS, right?
Mm.
So of course, because of the brand names, Wharton and Booth was at the forefront, right?
Yeah.
And this was a very difficult, question to answer. Right. The thing is, I had a scholarship from Booth. Of course, I tried to negotiate with Wharton for a scholarship, but that did not work, right?
Okay.
But I mean, even if I took away the scholarship, if I looked at it, since I wanted to be a sort of entrepreneur, right, I was looking for an environment where you have collaboration, where people are much more helpful to each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So literally, I went and talked to about 10 to 12 alumni from each of these schools.
Right.
And I asked them a series of questions, and the most important one ended up being, okay, if my left hand's collaborative and my right hand's competitive, where does your school lie? Right?
Yeah.
And we got Booth was much more collaborative than Wharton.
Right, right. That's interesting. So, when we know that, okay, there are rankings and there is US News ranking or there is Business Week ranking, and there are these top Ivy League school, the M7s, which are very aspirational for, most of us.
Yeah.
What do you think is, the difference between, say, an Ivy League school? Yes, there is a brand, but, why is the brand a brand? Like, what is the difference between, say, an Ivy League school versus, say, other B schools across the world?
Okay, so I mean, so if we look at it, you can look at it generally and you can look at it specifically, right? So generally, okay, so what does the brand do, right? So first is obviously in the professional market, right? The better the brand, there's more recognition.
Right.
Right. So, if you've got an MBA from Columbia versus an MBA from UNC, right? And, people who look at those for the same positions are obviously going to favor the Columbia one.
Yes.
Right. So that's one thing, right? Two is, I would say, not the quality of learning, but the sort of learning opportunities you have at the school.
Okay.
Right. So I've tend to see at these higher brands, right? You get a much bigger variety of courses and different things you can experience. Right? I'll give you one example, right? There was one class that I did called Developing New Products and Services. Okay, it was run by a professor, and what she had built this computer simulation.
Okay.
Right? Where each person in the class, they were a company in the simulation. Right? And you could all, play with inputs on, supply chain, on marketing, on pricing, on promotion. And it affects the whole market. And basically the class was to play that game and take on all the learnings from that.
Wow.
right? So you tend to find these much more niche-like experiences in the sort of bigger brand,
Right.
right? Then third is also the network you build, right? I mean, it's tied to sort of the relevance, but basically, the better the brand, what you see is that the network you build is phenomenal. I mean, like my booth network. So, I mean, I've changed careers quite a few times in my life, and each time my booth network has been there, right? I remember in 2015, I was looking for a job for quite a while, and I managed to generate over 40 interviews, right? And I would say at least 50%, right, were from connections of booth.
Right.
And they were at the Facebooks, the Googles, those types of companies.
Right.
Right? Yeah. Then last is the sort of recruitment. Right? So the thing is, what you do is, yes, I mean, the top brands, they do go to all the schools. Right? But what you find is that obviously they take more people from the top schools.
Right.
So take an example from a booth, you know, McKinsey might take 15, 20, 25 people, right? But from a lower school like NYU, they might only take 3, 5, 7, that time. Right? And so that sort of kind of feeds into that whole network as well, right? Because you have more people going into these top brands, and then as they go down their careers, you have a more accessible network.
Right. So how does this work in terms of the job options, right? While students are while they are in their MBA program, do they get options of getting internships, or do they get job offers in the first year itself in top schools, or how does it work? Or do they have to wait for the second semester to second year to get over? And because
no. So I mean, the thing is, it's with recruitment, it's what you put in is what you get out. Right. So I would say that probably only 30 to 40% of the positions are filled from on-campus recruiting.
Okay.
Right. The rest is people who have to go off-campus, network with companies, try and create positions, that type of stuff. Right. So 30, 40% are taken by the big brands who have the internship programs. Right. So it's really what you put in.
Right.
Sorry, does that answer your question? Or
yeah, absolutely. That's perfect. So Amrit, you've been working with so many students who have whom you have mentored, especially to top schools. So in your mind, or what do you think an Ivy League school actually look for in a candidate? So when you are doing a profile evaluation, or when you are looking at a profile to understand whether is this person a fit for one of the top Ivy League schools, what would you look at? And how does that, what do you think an Ivy League school looks at? Because does everyone has to be a rock star, or what exactly is
so they look at quite a few different things, right? So when I also look at a candidate, this is what I look at, right? So the first is obviously the work profile, right? And there's a few factors that come into this work profile, right? So, for instance, the first thing is like we talked about earlier, is brand.
Right.
Now, why do they look at brand? Right? Brand, they look at two things. One is that the bigger brands tend to be more selective in their recruitment process. Right? So it's kind of like someone's already done the work for me. Right? And they've validated these people's skills. Right? Second is also the quality of the work of the organization.
Okay.
Right. So, for instance, they would say that, okay, things that are Google versus a small startup, right? They have, much more established processes and so on. Right. And so, the work quality could be of a higher standard.
Right.
Right. So that's the brand. Right. Second is then they look at sort of the impact and the impact you've had for the organizations you worked for. And then the scale that you've worked for as well. Right. So A is, have you impacted the organization, and then B, how much have you impacted it by? Right. So so the thing is with that is like, okay, obviously some people go work for startups, etc. Right. But what I always say is that, okay, at least have one of your jobs, let them be a brand. Right. So that you can have that selectivity, you can have that. Okay, I've had that quality of work, and you can have that scale. right? Then go work at a startup or something, and then and so if you combine those two, then you sort of fulfill the selection criteria,
Right. Right.
right?
So how important is, having a brand on your resume in terms of your work experience?
I think for the top, the Ivy League schools or the top 12, top 15, I think it's very important.
Okay.
Right? It's not often that I see people without a brand, I mean, okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be, there doesn't have to be the Goldman, the McKinsey, right? It can be one of the big four, consulting firms, right? It could be one of the top engineering firms, right? So, I mean, it's not that it has to be one of the top brands.
Right. Right. So, say for example, if there are people who have, say worked in startups, their impact has been huge. The scale has been huge in terms of the kind of work they have done.
Yeah.
Maybe scale might not be huge, but the impact is definitely huge.
Yeah. Then of course then of course that's also that. So yeah, I mean, if you've had something distinctive, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. See, I mean, the thing is, like, if we went, look, okay, if we went in, so let's say, okay, work profile, right? So the other things they look for is also, okay, what have you done sort of above and beyond your responsibility?
Right.
Right. And then also, what have you done that makes you stand out from people who are similar to you?
Right.
Right. So if you're a consultant, did you work on a new vertical? Did you work on a new marquee client?
Right.
Right. Or if you're a banker, did you work with the C-level during this deal? Did you coordinate countries, teams in 4 or 5 countries?
Right.
Right. So I mean, that's what they look for work, right? And then education-wise, right? They look for a brand of school, obviously, that's the GMAT score, right? Now, we know for Indian applicants, the GMAT score, unfortunately, has to be high.
Yeah.
Right? For males, I mean, mostly it has to be 750. And for females, between 720 and 740, depending on the school.
Right. Right.
But the thing is, they look at all these different factors, right? I mean, the few other things of just to finish off the list, right? The other thing they look at is, okay, how have you been involved in the communities you're surrounded by? Right? So what extracurriculars have you done? Your leadership experiences outside of work. Right? Have you helped an NGO? Have you, consulted with startups? Have you, tutored and mentored underprivileged children?
Right.
Right? And I've had clients, like, for instance, one client I had, he had a very low GMAT score, sub 700, right? But he had amazing extracurriculars.
Right.
He got into the Indian Air Force. He worked on some projects with NASA. He set up some healthcare programs in rural healthcare programs, right? And so when you have instances like this, and he had a good work brand, right? So you can sort of, if you have something that stands out, then you don't necessarily have to have everything. So, for instance, I mean, I know it's a long answer to your question, but for the Wharton, that guy who's scaled up that startup, of course, he could have a shot at Wharton.
Right. Perfect. So, you mentioned about the community aspect of it, right? So, how important is it to have that, and why do schools look for the community aspect of it, or the the extracurricular aspect of it?
Yeah. Okay.
Why do they even want to look at that aspect?
Yeah. So I would say there's probably 2 or 3 major reasons, right? So why do they look at so one way they look at it is they say, look, we want people who are going to be involved in our community, right? Involved in our community, and for us, past behavior is a indicator of future behavior, right? Yeah. The second reason is they want to see that you've demonstrated leadership outside of work as well. Yeah. Because as professionals develop, they're not only involved in leadership in work, but most of them are develop leadership positions outside of work as well.
Right.
And then third, I think most importantly is which is one thing they also look for in the application is that showing initiative. Right? Because like I said, the whole business school experience is about what you take from it, right? So it's all about initiative to do the networking, to try different activities, right? For personal development, right? Try different leadership crisis challenges, try all these different things. Right. So they want to see that people have that initiative.
Right. So how much of some people also have this question where they come to us and say that, I've been doing this for the last 1 year, or I've been doing, this kind of community service for 6 months now,
Yeah.
or do you think if I start something now, I would be able to apply next year to an Ivy League school? What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on these kind of questions?
Yeah. So I mean, with extracurriculars, right? I say try to have at least 2 major ones that were started at least the calendar year before you apply.
Yeah.
Right. Ideally, you want one thing that you've been involved in with a few years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then 1 or 2 things that have been in the last year and a half, right? And more than just like sort of a singular involvement of like setting up an event or a conference, unless it's a big one, right? And then I also tell people to mix up between what I call strategic activities and tactical activities.
Yes.
Right. So by strategic activities, I mean that I helped raise funding for this NGO, right? Or I developed this curriculum to teach.
Right.
Right. And tactical is where it's more like I gave some of my time to go help someone.
Right.
Right. I tutored underprivileged children. I mean, there's one thing that business schools that have started looking at, right? What it's called is DQ. D for Denmark, Q for quotient, right?
Yeah.
It's called the decency quotient. So you have IQ and you have EQ.
EQ. Okay. This is DQ.
Right?
Okay.
DQ is this thing that people have been talking about in the last few years, which is it's called the decency quotient.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like, how much has this person helped, people, is a decent person and has helped people.
Right.
Right. So the thing is that's I was trying to reinforce the point that you want to show that, when you do tactical stuff that you're helping people.
Right. And do these things have to be connected to something that you are talking about in your past? Like, for example, how important is it to connect it to something that you have been doing, or, what you want to, you think you are as a person in the past also?
So here's the thing. I would say that, look, if your goals to go to business school are to be in the same career, right? I would say focus on getting the skills which will help you develop leadership.
Absolutely.
Right? If you want to change careers or change functions within a career, within an industry, then I'd say, get at least 1 or 2 of the activities to be, supportive of that. Right? So let's take an example. Right? So someone who's been working in tech startups and operations wants to be a product manager. Right? So the thing is, he's been getting a bit of exposure to product at work, right? But what I would suggest to him or her is that go do some pro bono product work for a startup, or, a small startup or 2.
Right.
Right? So that it demonstrates your interest.
Right. Right. Interesting. We got an understanding of, what it takes to get to a B school. You also mentioned a couple of things of, how it actually is at Booth, right? Like, for example, you spoke about the kind of, engagement that professors have in terms of the kind of projects they work with you on. Typically, how is life at B school? Like, when you have 2 years in your hand, there are so many clubs, there are so many resources, there's so many people you can network with. How does it actually work, with, in a B school, and, how does the first semester look like, and what should somebody expect, out of that 2 years of investment in terms of time, in terms of experience, everything? Okay.
So, actually, what I can say is you have to learn to prioritize.
Yeah.
Right? Here's the thing. When I went to B school, so the one greatest thing about B school, especially at these top schools, is they have something called grade non-disclosure. Right? What that means is that no employee is allowed to declare his grades to an employer.
Oh, okay.
No B school student is allowed to declare his grades to employer, and the employer is not allowed to ask.
Okay.
Right? So they do this so that because the thing is, if you're all competing on education, on grades, you're not going to do everything else.
Yeah.
Right? And so for me, I mean, it's up to you to define your priorities when you get there, right? Mine was to meet and get to know as many people as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and B, to try as many different things as possible,
Right.
right? So I sold ads for the school newspaper, right? I did stand-up comedy at the variety show,
Okay.
right? I organized a food conference, right? I was a career coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's I would say follow your passions, right? Because if you do something you're interested in, right? I mean, obviously you have to do the one or two of the professionals, right? So if you do things you're interested in, you're just going to get a better experience, and you're also going to get better connections with people.
Right. Right. So, in terms of when you get in, you think that okay, I'm coming from a finance background, and maybe what I want to do next is something related to finance and tech. Does it also happen that while you are at B school, you want to do something completely, you think of doing, completely changing the industry, or completely getting into something different post your MBA?
Sorry, could you repeat that last two lines then? It just
Yeah,
kind
so
of,
when people get into an MBA program, they
yeah,
typically have thoughts around what they want to do post their MBA, right? So they have their essays which talk about their post MBA career goals, right?
yeah,
So say, for example, you mentioned that you came from a finance background, and you also had this thing in your mind that I want to get into something related to maybe finance tech kind of a role, or maybe
yeah.
consulting as an option. Does this happen to many people, or maybe, anyone from your cohort, or even you for that matter, where they completely change their whole mindset while they are during their, while,
Of course.
yeah,
To be honest, the business schools, right? They know that you might not necessarily do what you put as your goals, right? But what they want to know is that you're mature enough and self-aware enough, right, to thought of a set of goals that is achievable by you and your profile,
right,
right? Because if you look at it for a business school, right, their recruiting numbers are like their revenue numbers,
mm,
right? And so for them, it's like if they want to see that someone's mature enough to make a plan and make sense, right? I mean, if someone's been a software programmer and they want to suddenly say they want to go into investment banking without any exposure to finance,
right,
right? How's that a believable story? Right? So firstly, they know that, right? And B, I would say it happens to a lot of people,
right,
right? I mean, mine was partly. I mean, I wanted to go into product management kind of when I got to school.
mm-hmm,
For me, it was unfortunate I was there during 2008 to 2010,
uh-huh,
right? So a lot of tech companies weren't hiring during that financial crisis, so I had to look at other professions. So I ended up in consulting.
right, right. Interesting. How should student actually plan their, entire Ivy League journey? So how soon should they start, or, when do you think they should actually start planning their entire MBA plan?
Well, I mean, they should start thinking about it probably a year or two before,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Oh,
So, I mean, I would go with this sort of checklist, right? That first thing is, within a few years before, you want to make sure, like I said, that you have a brand name, right? So if you've got one good brand name, then that's good, right? If you haven't, then get a brand or get a better brand,
right,
right? So that obviously you can't plan 6 months in advance, right? So it's like as you're starting to think about it,
mm-hmm,
right? Look at that, right? Then second is now at work, what can you do, right? So it's try and pick things that are going to help you to stand out from your competition,
right,
right? So volunteer for any internal committees, right?
mm-hmm,
Or if there's any big business development proposals,
mm-hmm,
right? Or if there's building a training program, mentoring. So just things that can show that you're really involved, that you go above and beyond, and that you're trying to better your community within work as well.
right,
Okay.
right,
Then a year before, like I mentioned before, I would start talking about the extracurricular activities, right? And so make sure that you're definitely involved in one strategic and one tactical minimum,
mm-hmm,
right? I mean, you should start thinking about what story you want, and then seeing, what can you do, with your activities to support that story,
right, right,
right? then I would say that, by the same calendar year, ideally you want your GMAT done by April, May latest.
Right.
Right, because then that gives you the freedom and the thought process that you could stay focused on the MBA applications, right, and not having to redo your GMAT. And the thing is, you should budget at least 2 attempts for the GMAT.
Right.
Right, because it's not often that people get the score they want on their first go. Right, so I would try and maybe attempt your first GMAT in February that year. Right, then it gives you a buffer to take it 1 or 2 more times if you need to. Right, and then when you start applications in May, it's all about school research. Right. So I mean, those are I think those are the main key points that I would have.
So I have 2 questions here. One question is, like you mentioned more about the GMAT aspect, right? So you mentioned it's very important for people to really score high because when you're applying to an Ivy League school, the competition is very high. How does a school look at multiple attempts? Do they really bother about it, or?
I think no. I think up to like 3, 4, 5, right? They know that you're trying to do what you need to do. Right. I think when it comes to like 6, 7, 8, it becomes a bit tough. That maybe it would be if you can't get the GMAT after 4, 5 times, maybe switch to the GRE. Right. So I mean, it's just common sense, basically.
Right. And in your view, how much time, you mentioned one more thing about the research aspect, right? So when you say research for the school, what is the kind of research that they should be focusing on, and how should they go about it? So apart from obviously reading up on the school website, what is the research consists of?
Well, so the thing is, first you have to determine your goals. Right. Once you determine your career goals for after business school, right? Then what do I get my clients to do? I get them to do a skill gap analysis between where they are currently and their long-term goal. Right. So I'll give you an example. So when I applied to business school, right, I had software development, I had financial engineering, I had derivatives trading. Right. And I said my goals was to be a financial software entrepreneur, banking software entrepreneur, right? So now if I look at it, for me to be an entrepreneur, right, the 3 or 4 things I'm going to want to learn in business school, right? One will be sort of marketing and operations, because I haven't had any exposure to that, right? 2 would be entrepreneurship, right? 3 is I want to build my network and knowledge of my banking technology industry. And the 4th thing, I need leadership. Right? So then using these 4 skills, I then say that, okay, this is how I drive my school research. Right? I find out all the cool things they're doing in these 3 or 4 skill buckets. Right? And then I can use this content in the essays, and when they ask why this school, right, you're kind of just saying that, okay, I want to pick up these skills, and this is the things you have on offer for these skills.
Right. So I had one question here. So, when you're reaching out to alumni, and when you're, talking to people who are from, who have been from that particular school, what is the so one aspect that I always tell students is, please don't ask questions which is already available on their website.
Exactly.
Right?
That can be answered. Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, people will not really enjoy talking to you, or will not be motivated to help you. The other aspect of it is, should they specifically focus on people who have been from their kind of a background and doing something else, or should they just talk to specific alumni of various different kind of industries to get an idea?
No, it should be again anything catered towards the goals. So what I tell my clients, so for instance, okay, in my case, the example I gave, I would have reached out to people in the entrepreneurship club. I would reach out to people in the tech club. Right. I would reach out to people in any sort of who'd done any product management internships. Right. And I would talk to them. And so the way to approach, like you said, don't ask anything that's on the website. What you do is do the research first and say, hey, I'm interested in this class and this class. Would my goal is this. Would love to have you. What do you say? tell me if these are the right things to do, or if there's better options, better opportunities at school to learn.
Right, right, right. So I'll do one thing. I'll just take some questions now.
Sure.
Let me just read out a few questions. So I have my Q&A window in front of me. Hold on, let me just pull it. Okay, I'd like to pick questions which are slightly more generic. So there's one question which says, what basis do people actually get scholarships?
Okay.
Yeah.
So scholarships is a function of a few things, right? I would say, GMAT score is one, right? How well you've done your school research and showed that in your essays and your interviews. And 3 would be your work profile.
Right.
Right, and it's also depends if you're a popular demographic that business schools are looking for. Every year they're looking at certain demographics, right?
So when you say demographic, is it economy based? Like what exactly is required, and how many jobs are available for that particular?
It's actually something it's something that the schools kind of come up with when as per when they need it.
Right. Okay. So I'll just let it. I'm just looking at another question. So there's a question that says, despite a good GMAT score, a candidate's profile matters a lot. What is the question? Okay. The question says, but it is not, okay, despite a good GMAT score, candidate profile matters a lot, but it is not necessary that a person, his school or college life is much exposed to social service or academics, especially in Indian schools. Then in such cases, what will the admissions committee actually look at?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So she asked that if the candidate has a good GMAT score and the profile also is decent enough,
yeah.
However, in terms of the education bit, which you mentioned, right, which is also one aspect of the profile that they look at, does not have too much of extracurriculars or, does not have too much to show in terms of the education aspect of it. What would the admission council actually look at in such cases?
Well, okay, so it depends on what the case about the education is, right? I mean, there's 2 cases where it's either not such a big brand or the grades were low. Right now, the schools look at the education more to say, okay, will they be able to handle the studying of an MBA, right? So depending on which case you have, I mean, obviously, if you don't have as good a school, you want to obviously score higher on the GMAT, right?
Right.
And if you don't have the grades, then there's several things you can do to try and combat that, right? So one instance, there's something called MBA math, right? So for clients who've had low grades or who haven't had much quant exposure, I ask them to do this course, which are basically MBA entry-level courses on finance, accounting, economics, so on.
Yeah.
Right, and then they can get they get good grades on that, and then we do that. So it's on a case-by-case basis.
Right. So there's one more question over here. It says, this person is part of a small VC firm. So his question is, how does that look more as a pre-MBA work experience? Being part of being a VC.
Not bad. I mean, is it only been at a VC firm, or is there something else before?
Okay. He just says that how does a small VC look like as a pre-MBA experience?
I mean, it looks okay. It really depends on what's come before, but if there's anything else.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if it's a really small VC firm and that's what you've worked in, how do we show, the impact you've had?
Right. There's another question here. How important is international exposure?
I mean, especially if we're looking at it from the lens of an Indian candidate, right? What do you say? It is nice to have because it gives you something in front of your competition. But a lot of Indian candidates, it's tough for them to have international experience. It's not a have to. Right? There are some schools like INSEAD which have a preference for international experience.
Yes.
And so, I would steer a client away from those sort of schools if they haven't had. right? But I mean, for Indians, they understand.
Right, right. How important is work X? Because most schools, if you look at the average experience, they say 3 to 5 years, right? So there's one question over here which says that no, some schools do not specify that work X is required. But how important, in your view, is work experience?
I think it's very important, right? Because because remember, like I said before, schools want you to contribute to their community, right? So if you haven't had any work experience, how do you contribute to a case discussion or a consulting project?
Correct.
Right? So I mean, of course, there are cases they do accept a very small percentage, maybe a few people right after college. I mean, if I think in my class of 600, there was probably maybe 2 or 3 people who came right after college.
Mm-hmm.
But they'd also done some different things during their college internships and so on. Right? So I think it's much more important because, again, like if you don't have a work experience, how do I hold you to what brand you've been in and what quality of work you've done?
Right. Right. When it comes to someone who's an entrepreneur, how does a B school look at that? And what would they look at, in the entrepreneurial stint?
So again, right, it's scale, right? So firstly is entrepreneurship. I mean, most of the clients I work with who are entrepreneurs went and worked somewhere beforehand.
Okay.
Right. So again, so they would have some sort of brand, whether it's a Flipkart or a CureFit or something, right? But with entrepreneurship, they would look at size of funding, size of revenue. If there was, I've had a lot of clients who've had acqui-hires, right? So again, it's just scale and what you've done.
Right, right. So I see a lot of questions here, which is more specific to profiles, their own profiles. So let me just see if I can find some generic ones and, let me just pick those kind of questions. So there is one question which says, I'm not sure whether, we'll give it a shot. How much of weightage is given towards a brand of an undergraduate institute, especially for an Indian applicant?
I can't give an exact number for that.
Yeah.
Right. See, it's the combination of the undergrad brand, the grades, and the GMAT score. They look at that more as a whole together.
Right. Right.
And it's hard to attribute like this is 20%, right? You can't do that really.
Yeah, I agree. So when you talk about work experience, right? Is it always after graduation? What if somebody has worked before graduation and then finish their graduation and then work for some more time? In such cases, what happens?
It's full-time work experience, right? So I mean, we have the people who do articleships, right? Or who are accountants who do articleships. So they, we count that experience as work experience, right? So it's full-time experience.
Okay. As an employee, or is it more like the full-time employment has to be there? That's what counts as work experience.
Yeah, employment. I mean, you can be your own business as well. Again, what you've achieved.
Right. Let me just look at some other questions here. Guys, if you have very specific questions with respect to your profile, my colleague Rachel is just putting down a form here on the chat window. We will specifically look at specific profiles. If you're really looking at applying to an Ivy League school, separately, we can do it one-on-one later too. Let me just take slightly more generic questions for the interest of everyone here who's listening to us. There is one question over here. What if there is a gap between a last work experience at a big brand and the current year of MBA application? How does a gap year look like for a B school?
Like a whole year, or just like a 3-6 month?
A gap year. The whole year.
It depends on what you've done with it.
Right.
It really depends what you've done with it. So, again, it would be, if you've done something constructive, right, which especially, and then some part of it, should align with your goals. Right. Some part of it should be to help the community. Right. And then some part of it should be other extracurriculars, which might also support your interest in your goals. Right. So it's not a total no, but, you just got to be able to show what you've done with it. And how it's helped you.
Right. How much of impact does client-facing role have? Because there's a question here who says that I've worked in one of the big McKinsey, BCG, Bain kind of companies, but not
Yeah.
worked in client facing roles, but more on say administrative roles or back end roles. How
Yeah.
does that look for especially in a B school?
So again, okay, they understand. They obviously the front office, mid office, back office makes a difference,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So it would be that if you're a McKinsey front office, and maybe I'd say, okay, let's look at M5, M7, right? And if you were the back office or middle office, I'd say, okay, let's look a rung lower, right? Because they do value the front office work much more than the back office or middle office. But it's also again what you've achieved compared to your competition, right? So I had one client who was in research in BCG, and he got promoted 3 times. Right. So if he's done that, then I'm going to say, okay, we can look at maybe some of the M5, because it's how are you going to stand out amongst other people who have similar positions.
Right. There's one more question that I had is about diversity, right? So how diverse, like for example, if there's somebody who's coming from a law background, or there are some, I see a lot of questions here. There's someone who's from fashion background. How does a B school look at very specific diverse profiles?
So they look at it. Okay, in the end, the way they look at it is, how employable is this person going to be after he comes to business school? Right, because it goes down to the recruitment numbers, right?
Right.
So again, how employable is this person going to be, and and has he come up with a plan that makes sense? Right. So again, they'll compare you to other lawyers, right? Now the thing is also that you have to understand there's like 15-20% of the process that we can't control. Right? It's like, okay, who else, how many other people with similar profiles have applied?
Yes.
Right? What are the target demographics that schools are looking for? Right? Which round have you applied in? Right? Who read the file first? What are they going to write? Right? So I mean, it really just depends on how you reflect amongst your competition,
right,
and how compelling your story is about your goals and your support, your passion in it.
Right. Do B schools actually have a preference in terms of finance or people from technology background, or
I mean, some schools do, right? I mean, so Harvard tends to be more general management. Kellogg tends to be more consulting. Ross, the biggest recruiter, is Amazon.
Right.
Columbia is very good for private equity. So I mean, the schools do have that couple of niches here and there.
Right. I'll just scroll through some questions. Again, guys, I'm going to take only questions which are slightly more generic in nature and make sense or are in the scope of this particular session today. Okay, the people have asked about online MBA and things like that. Frankly, this is not in the scope of the session today, but
out of my scope too.
yeah. Let me just look at if there's anything else. There are lots and lots of questions. I have to just scroll through so many right now. Okay, there's there's someone who says I have 3 years of internship, which is the articleship as part of the chartered accountancy course. Can I portray this as work experience on my resume as it's with a big brand? Or should I just state it as internship?
No, the articleship, we always put it as full-time experience.
Full-time experience. Okay.
Yeah, because they're working the 30, 40, 50 hours a week. Right? So,
yeah, yeah,
that's crazy.
So there is a question if the experience in management marketing candidate differs from what he studied. Okay, interesting question. So he says that, he's done a graduation as an engineer, but his experience is completely different. He's done something with respect to sales and marketing. Is there a different perspective to these kind of profiles?
No, it's all future looking forward.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, people can understand people doing different things at work from undergrad. Right. Most of us do. Right. It's more that, okay, he's doing sales and marketing. What does he want to do now that he wants to get this MBA for?
Right.
Right. So that whole switch, that doesn't matter.
Right, right. So there's one question. It says, how do B schools look at older applicants? When I say older applicants, about 35.
Yeah, well, so that's what I said. They struggle. I mean, you have to make a very compelling story
Hmm.
about why you would want to potentially start at junior positions, right? And at sort of not junior as in post MBA positions at that age,
Right,
right? So you really have to make sure you emphasize in your story why that's the case. You want to do that,
right, right,
right? I mean, the thing is, when they come to 35, they start thinking of you more as a executive MBA candidate.
right, right. Let me just take a couple of more questions. So there's one question which says, I have 14 years of experience in supply chain. I got a work experience across 5 industries, currently with an FMCG. Post MBA, I plan to stick with an FMCG and work more towards managing P&Ls and, those kind of roles. Do you think B school, what kind of schools should I really be looking at?
I need to know a lot more information.
Yeah, I agree.
I need to know a lot more, 20-minute chat minimum.
Yeah, so GMAT is very important. We really need to, that's a very big variable here. We don't really know your GMAT score. And in terms of, so is there anything like an ideal score? This is also something that a lot of people ask me that, I want to apply to this school. How much do you think should I score? So how do you answer such a question?
Well, I mean, if you come to me as an Indian male, I say 760 is the ideal score. Right? 760, and then for female, 740, 750.
Right. Is it because there are less number of female applicants?
Yeah, it seems to be one of the demographics that are favorited by the schools right now for the last few years.
Okay, cool. Well, guys, if you have any other questions specific to your profile, please use the link on the chat window. We would love to discuss it specifically with you guys. I would also like to discuss how we go about the entire Ivy League application process here at CrackVerbal. So what we do is initially we get started with assessing your profile. We try to understand and help you assessing on what kind of schools you could be applying to. So there is some kind of pre-work that happens over there. Once that happens, we have to focus on making sure that we have a story around, plan out what should be your strategy around how you should go about applying. In terms of the pre-work part, there's also the research that Amrit spoke about. Those kind of things come into the pre-work part. Finally, once you start writing your first draft, we do multiple round of reviews. There are multiple feedback rounds. And finally, we have to just make sure that you are, top B school applying ready, right? So which means your essays have to be, watertight in terms of your story, in terms of your thought process, in terms of your post-MBA career goals. So this is typically the kind of process we follow in terms of, how we go about helping students with their applications. Like I mentioned, we have a 30-minute profile evaluation for you. If you could just fill in the form on the chat window, we would love to help you with respect to your application this year. Especially if you're looking at working with Amrit, if you're looking at applying to top schools, just fill in, this form. We would, we'll definitely get back to you, try and understand how we can help you and give you some direction around how you can plan your entire application process, right? So I guess that's about it. If we have missed any of thing, just drop us an email or just put it in this form itself so that we can help you out. I'll just take a last final quick look if I have any other questions. So I think we've answered most of the questions. Okay, there is one last question. Let me just take that. Yep. So there's someone who's asking about letters of recommendation. So how much of difference does that have in terms of the recommender's profile? Like how important is a very good recommender?
Well, it's a balance between I get this question a lot, title versus how well they know you, right? So it's a balance of the two. Like given the choice of let's say if we're in a consulting environment, right? Given the choice of a partner who doesn't know your work as well, right?
Mm.
And the manager who knows your work really well, I would pick the manager who knows your work really well.
Right. Right.
Right. So it's a balance. Even when I go through the clients, we fill out a whole worksheet where we look at 5 or 7 different criteria about the recommender, and we look at the stories that they can talk about.
Right.
And then once we have all that information, we can then do the analysis and say, okay, these are the better recommenders.
Right. Amrit, this has been extremely valuable and very,
Very
very
welcome.
informative.
Enjoyed it.
We really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm sure all of you had a great time getting information about how to apply to top B schools. Look forward to listening to your story. You could just, like I said, just put in your details on the form and let us help you out plan your next steps. Thanks a lot.